Here we go!
A good Mario game can define a video game console, but a great Mario game can define a gaming generation. At the end of the previous millennium, Nintendo solidified the work done during the era of the 8-bit microcomputers, and it brought a sense of solidarity to the industry with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System. And Shigeru Miyamoto defined the platforming genre with the release of Super Mario Bros. This gave them a brief period of global domination of the industry, where there were some regional black spots where the Nintendo brand really failed to penetrate. The competitors like Sega rose as their first major valid international competition, beating them to the gate with a 16-bit next generation machine in the Mega Drive, or Genesis if you're in America, console, and then launched Sonic the Hedgehog to deny the new Super Nintendo top console billing in 1991. But longevity was on Nintendo's side, and they stood by the Super Nintendo while Sega got obsessed with early 32-bit processors, squandering their foothold in the market with some really awkward accessories and console add-ons that fractured their market. Whilst the Sega Saturn was a success in Japan, by 1995 everywhere else was dominated by the newly arrived Sony PlayStation console, giving this newcomer to the video game market a solid year to build a new rabid fan base before Nintendo felt that they were able to respond with their own new console and with it their own new Mario game. Super Mario 64 was an amazing game for its time. However, with the passing years, it's perhaps become more memorable as a piece of gaming history than as an excursion in its own right. Every aspect of this game has been mimicked, repeated and evolved so many times it can be difficult to isolate one Mario game from another. The original 3D outing of this franchise has some very memorable levels, and the concept of small, explorable worlds hidden throughout a castle that you have to enter one at a time is quite a novel and nice idea, cribbed purely from Castle of Illusion on the Sega Genesis. Described in contemporary media at the time as a set of vast labyrinthine levels, it's hard to picture in your mind just what the world was like in the 1990s that could consider these small little sandbox areas vast. Well, the majority of them are definitely incredibly short, and it can actually feel a little bit unfulfilling being booted back to the hub castle after collecting each star. Yet, for all of its myriad of faults, it's hard not to fall in love at least a little bit with Super Mario 64. And its quirky eccentricity that falls just on the right side of trying too hard. The thing that amazes me about this period is how obsessed we were all with numbers at the time. The massive library of 8-bit microcomputers struggling for a foothold, the 16-bit Sega Genesis vs Super Nintendo console war, the disaster of the 32X, the Nintendo 64, Super Mario 64. The last Mario game hadn't had a number on it, but the one before that had been Super Mario 3, meaning that by my count, Nintendo skipped 59 entries in just 5 years. But the obsession with who had the biggest numbers pretty much ends here. Sega and Sony both briefly toyed with upselling the Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2 as 128-bit machines, but it was a hollow claim at best. Both because the numbers had become a little bit meaningless and also because it wasn't technically true. When developing the next generation after this one, Nintendo did produce a Super Mario 128 demo. But that was more about how many characters they could fit on the screen at the same time, and it was a wonderful little concept that evolved into the new video game series, Pikmin. It's not that we have given up with the obsession of computational power either. Through the years, several console generations later, we would battle against the number of teraflops that the GPU and the Xbox could handle in excess of the PlayStation. But the idea of a number dominating a console generation, or even a game, is an idea that's long consigned to history. And it's one that anyone born after 1995 probably finds completely unfathomable. Yet, it's an idea that completely justified why Super Mario 64 was a gaming revelation in 1996 that turns heads from around the gaming industry. Players had never seen anything like this when it was released for two reasons. One is the seamless transition of platform gaming into 3 dimensions. The use of a joystick rather than a flat analog pad to dictate his movement. Mario 64 was used as a reference game throughout the design of the Nintendo console machine, and its rather unique controller that boasted just the one, very firmly central analog stick. The original PlayStation controller only had the 4 direction buttons, and it would take them until 1998 to develop the DualShock controller, bringing this innovation to the machine. The generic Sega Saturn controller had a more fluid circular D-pad, and it was Sonic Team themselves who were busy working on their 1996 aerial 3D flagship title Nights into Dreams that launched with its own bespoke 3D control pad. But whilst Nights went on to build a strong cult following, it was a new IP that failed to get the traction Sega needed outside of Japan, while Super Mario 64 was the most important game for a generation. Released that same year, the next biggest adventure games with three-dimensional controls were new franchises such as Resident Evil and Tomb Raider, both of which adopted tank controls where you moved forwards or turned sideways with the direction buttons. But one of them used fixed pre-rendered cameras, whilst the other hugged the player's back. One of the most infamous misfires of this generation was Bubsy 3D, whose approach was something halfway between Tomb Raider and the old first-person shooter template from ID Software, but they completely mishandled both the jump mechanic and the turning. In all of these games, the style comes from the developers trying to solve the problem of showing everything that the player needs to see, both where they are and where they're going, at the same time. Making these types of games was hard, and it would be several years before platform games with the same fidelity of controls, movement and camera as Super Mario 64 became commonplace. Chris Sutherland, head programmer at Nintendo's third-party studio Rare, likened the camera of Mario 64 to a kite, one that would let Mario move around a little freely and then pull taut when he reached a fixed distance away. Over at Naughty Dog, the developers of Crash Bandicoot, sitting on a very nearly complete game, paused in amazement when Mario 64 was shown to the public ahead of its release. This team had been developing the game with Sony's blessing as a potential new mascot for the PlayStation franchise. A new console for a new era needed a new style of game, and although three-dimensional platformers weren't new, all agreed that they were universally abysmal. Naughty Dog had worked on developing Crash to avoid all of the pitfalls that everyone else was making. They built a camera system that moved along fixed branching rails, carefully designing their game to put the maximum amount of detail and the number of obstacles on screen to make one of the most engaging 3D games of Sony's first console. But when Mario 64 was shown to the press and then launched a month ahead of Sony's marsupial, it gave an entirely new textural feel to the game that was unprecedented. Nintendo resolved the limitations of the hardware by creating very small sandbox worlds that, whilst each of them only contained a few specific areas, all felt very distinct and unique. By inviting you to scour them for secrets and hidden items, they ensured that all of the hard work had gone into designing the stages would then be shown to the player, creating density rather than breadth with only 15 unique worlds and 3 boss levels. Theming, with distinct colours and swinging soundtracks, created a vivid impression that would be remembered fondly for years to come. Using Peach's Castle as a hub world, the player has a lot of freedom to dive in and out of the unique levels built by Miyamoto's team at their own will. And yet, there were problems. The camera AI was revolutionary, but it brought entirely new problems to gameplay that had never been seen before. Going back to Mario 64 years later, this is perhaps the way the game has aged the most poorly. The camera is fine 90% of the time, but that 10% where you want a little bit more control over it, the game suddenly feels awkward and clunky. It would be several years before having 2 joysticks, the design innovation of Sony's DualShock controller, would become an industry norm, and that second right hand would be commonly used to direct the camera. I recently went back to replay Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast, which was Yuji Naka's direct response to Mario's own transition to 3D, and I recalled with some shock how, for most of the early 2000s, it was common industry practice to rotate the camera with the shoulder buttons. Yuji Naka's evolution on the design template set here by Miyamoto was to have the camera swing to face the direction he wished the character to travel. However, that comes from the downside of limiting player freedom and restricting them from exploring. The Mario 64 camera, meanwhile, is usually best left to its own devices. The controller face buttons allow for small adjustments, but it's not fluid or quick. Without this game, the foundations of all of our future game designs are built upon, they would not be the same. Whilst the Nintendo and Sony team were checking each other out, both were fully aware that their products were far from interchangeable. Nintendo could not hope to match the detailed fine textures on the Sony platform, as seen in Crash Bandicoot and later Spyro the Dragon, and the PlayStation couldn't display the big, vibrant textures that the entire Mario game was built around without warping them considerably. Despite being a launch game, Mario 64 was designed to tax the new system to its utmost limit. The game used every ounce of the 64-bit GPU and CPU processors to stretch the game textures around these large polygons on display. Nintendo effectively skipped the 32-bit gaming generation, arguably left to be just a rather one-sided fistfight between the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation console, to bring out one of the first 64-bit gaming machines onto the market. It's those numbers again, it's our obsession with understanding the machines that we're playing on. To summarise, an 8-bit microprocessor can add two 8-bit numbers together in a single instruction. An 8-bit number means that it can be any integer between 1 and 2 to the power of 8, which is 256. Have you ever wondered why Link can't have more than 256 rupees in the original Legend of Zelda? Because it's an 8-bit game, and the process of keeping track of your wealth can't count higher than 2 to the power of 8. 256. The 16-bit processors, however, can handle two operations up to 2 to the power of 16, which is 65,536. 32-bit processors can handle operations far larger in size, integers up to over 4,294 million. 64-bit programs and processors are exponentially more powerful, and yet, even nearly 3 decades later, we don't commonly have 128-bit processors, machines that can carry out operations on 128-bit integers. There's simply not enough advantage in that additional level of power. Whilst their competitors were fighting for the 32-bit crown, Nintendo skipped a hardware generation to bring a machine into the world and a Mario game into the world that in pure programming language speaks to the same level of sophistication that Windows 11 would still use 2.5 decades later. It's incredibly primitive technology compared to what we have now, but at least it speaks our language. And that is really what I think of when I play of Mario 64. I see it in every other 3D platforming game I play. From the games that came in its wake, such as Banjo-Kazooie, Sonic Adventure and Jak and Daxter, through to decades later with the arrival of Yooka-Laylee, A Hat in Time and It Takes Two, the language of platform video games for the next half a century. Whether you like the game very much or have any interest in going back to replay it, I can always respect that at least.